Does anyone have a question from last week? No comments, no question. Okay, well then let's plow ahead then to Matthew 8 and Matthew 9. I want to begin by stating something that y'all probably know, but just it's always a nice, I think, reminder. Is then when the writer of the Gospel of Matthew wrote it originally, there were no chapters and verses. I mean, he just wrote it, and it wasn't later until chapters and verses were added, and those added obviously so that we could find things quickly, right? Matthew chapter 8 verse 19 or whatever, you can turn to that, pretty quick. But because of the chapters and verses, sometimes things that are not meant to be separated get separated out. And so we think of these as two separate chapters, but 8 and 9 are actually one kind of section. Like they are meant to be together. They're thematically 8 and 9 is one big chapter, not two separate chapters. They're just broken up that way so we can find verses quickly. And maybe as you read through chapters 8 and 9, that maybe occurred to you. Any guesses after reading 8 and 9 if you had to kind of say what you think the overall theme of chapters 8 and 9 are, if you had to narrow that down to one overarching theme, anything jump out at you? Miracles, yeah. It's yeah. So yes, one specific type of miracle.
Healing.
Yeah. Correct. Yeah. So 8 and 9. So we just come out of the first discourse, right? Which is the Sermon on the Mount. We got to the end of chapter 7. And now when Jesus had finished saying these things, there's that clue that we're changing directions and everything. You might even have in your translation a nice space, a kind of a double space in between the end of chapter 7 and the end of the beginning of chapter 8, kind of marking that we're moving thematically on. And chapters 8 and 9, if we were going to give it the theme that binds it all together, it would be the healing miracles or establishing Jesus's authority and power as a healer. And you might say, well, there's also some exorcisms and some casting out of demons in there as well. But I would like to commend to you the idea that in the ancient world, spiritual health and physical health is very similar to the way now in the modern world we think of mental health and physical health. How you can be having a panic attack and it can manifest itself to look like a heart attack. Or if you are living with chronic pain, it can manifest itself in depression, in despair, and these type of things. In Jesus's time, the link between spiritual health and particularly spiritual malady would manifest itself physically. And we'll get a very clear story of that at the beginning of chapter 9. But it's interesting. Did anyone work in the healthcare field? Like some of our folks who are absent today did work in the medical field. I was going to ask them, but there's even been a movement within a lot of hospitals that, even if they're not religiously based, a faith-based hospital or have an historic connection to a faith-based community, that chaplains have been brought on as core members of the care team, and so this sort of like mind, body, spirit, holistic approach to healing is very much the way that Jesus kind of approaches it in these two chapters. So before we look at them individually, let me just kind of tease some things out for us. So notice the wide variety of people that Jesus is healing. I counted. He heals Jews and non-Jews. He heals both men and women. He heals both young and old and in between, right? So there seems to be kind of a non-discriminatory kind of aspect to Jesus' healing ministry. He's not just healing Jews, not just healing men, not just healing and he's healing a variety of maladies, from leprosy to paralysis to blood diseases. There's a real holistic understanding of healing there. Sometimes he actually touches the person. Other times he just speaks a word. Other times sometimes the person is present. Sometimes the person's not even on site, and so this gives us a very wide understanding of Jesus's healing ministry. And of the titles or the type of ministry that Jesus was known for, healing is right at the top. So these two chapters are vitally important to establish that to Jesus. It really gives a totality of his healing powers and his healing and the importance of his healing ministry. He's also, the way I kind of looked at it was he's not a one-trick pony. He sometimes will, even not necessarily in these two chapters, but we'll see in other chapters when he does the healing. Sometimes he even uses sort of like rudimentary healing techniques. It's not just him speaking a word, but like he'll spit or he'll grab mud or something like that, and almost kind of like a shamanistic kind of like healing technique. But yeah. So anyway, these two chapters really kind of establish that for us. But each one's also slightly different. They're not all the same, but they give, like I said, a full picture of it. So does that make sense to everyone? Is that resonating with the way that what you read in chapter 8 and chapter 9? Of course, there's some teachings in there as well, and there's some conversations about fasting and some conversations. You get the call of Matthew. We'll look at all of that, but overall, these two chapters really are about the healing ministry of Jesus. Yeah, which is important to us, right? Well, at least hopefully it becomes important to us. And part of that healing, part of the church's mission is to be part of that healing ministry as well. So any thoughts or questions about that? Comments? Are they one of the things I always kind of like to ask is how, when y'all read the healing miracles, what do you get out of it? What are they easy for you to digest and to accept, or do you read them with some skepticism, or do you are you like, how did he actually do that, or do you just kind of take them on face value? Always been interested in how people react to the healing ministry or the healing ministry of Jesus.
I take all of them. Like sometimes you wonder how did he do them? Did he really do it? Then I'm always amazed at the people that are seeing these things and what their reactions are, what There's so much turmoil going on now, people trying to find someone to follow, someone to trust, and someone to believe. And I don't have my book, but one of these where after the crowd tells him to leave, go away.
Yeah,
And I was gonna ask you about that. I mean, what's that about? You would think they'd say, are they scared or, no, they just see this and,
right.
you know, yeah.
Yeah, so yeah, if you want to, we can go to that fun one right now. Real quick, is that, those of you online, are you hearing the fan? No, it's the speaker on the owl's not picking up there's a fan blowing in this room. Y'all aren't picking it up?
I can hear you
Okay.
fine.
All right, just want to make sure. So yeah, if you want to, let's jump ahead. That's always a fun one. So why don't we jump ahead to chapter 9? That's what I think that one's in chapter 9. Yeah, chapter 9 verses. Oh, maybe I'm sorry. Why don't I just look at my notes? I wrote it.
I couldn't find it, sorry.
It is chapter 8, verse 28. So, the first clue that Jesus is in a different space is he goes to the other side of the lake. So now he is in non-Jewish territory. So, in many ways, this pairs with the story before it, which is the calming of the storm. And the reason why it pairs very nicely with the story before it, in terms of the calming of the storm, is Jesus shows in the calming of the storm that he has the same authority that God had at the creation of the world. And that if you remember Genesis 1, God looked out and saw water everywhere and it was chaotic. And the first thing that God does is calm the storm and move it aside so that order and growth and life can take place, right? So in many ways, the calming of the storm story is an allusion to that story in Genesis where we have Jesus commanding the waters into chaos. So things that might not be clear to us in the 21st century, John, that would have been common knowledge for our first century friends who are experiencing this in real time and then and reading the gospel, is there was a common understanding that the origin of unclean spirits and malevolent, I always had trouble with that word. I always love it, but I struggle with malevolent spiritual forces are found in the water, in the sea, in the ocean, from Leviathan to other things. So by also calming the storm, the thought was the storm was caused by these unclean spirits and these other spiritual beings that sort of like makes life difficult on the sea. And so like Jesus calming them or calming it, he's also controlling those sort of spiritual forces as well. Okay, so then that pairs really well once we get here, because now Jesus is confronted in this story by two men living with demonic spirits that are attached to them or inside them. In the Gospel of Mark, there's only one. He is bound to it's the same story, just different details. In Mark, it's one person bound, chained to a stone, and Jesus has a conversation with the unclean spirit, the demonic spirit, and the demon calls itself Legion, right? We are Legion in there. Here, we don't get the name Legion, and there's two guys, not just one. But it's the same outcome, which is Jesus casts out the demon, And the demons asked to go into the pig herd, the swine herd. All right. I actually think this is, okay, it's not funny, haha, because like lots of pigs died. That's not funny. But it's funny, haha, it's funny in a way in that this is a severe cultural miscommunication. Jesus, as a Jew, sees the pigs as unclean animals. He sends unclean spirits into unclean animals. And then the animals possessed by the unclean spirits go home to the sea. Now they're crazed and and it ends up being this horrible bloody mess. But to the Gentiles who were those pig farmers, those animals aren't unclean. That's our livelihood. And so they asked Jesus to leave because he has caused great economic harm to them. Please leave our neighborhood.
Okay.
And so it's this cultural miscommunication. Jesus thinks he's doing something, something good for this guy who's living with these guys that are living with demons. And the people are just like, you destroyed our pigs. Like, what are you doing? Please leave.
Okay.
That
makes sense.
The
crazy boat ride now. I'm sure, let's say hypothetically, they're out in the lake next week and they have the same storm.
Yeah.
Jesus is sleeping in the boat. I gotta believe they're not just gonna sit there and say, oh, this is going away. They're running and waking them up again.
They are.
They are.
Yeah,
So,
right. I think
I
so.
know what he's teaching them and know what he's saying. And that's some reflection of what happens to him when he tells them about his faith and tells them to happen.
Yeah.
They're gonna have faith.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, I always thought the Gospels are so fast. And they just kind of tell one story and then they move on to the next and they don't circle back very well. Some better than others. John is more narrative in that way. But anyway, I'm glad you brought that up. That's one of my favorite stories because I actually find, again, it's not funny because a lot of pigs die and that's not funny. But there is this kind of cultural miscommunication thing that goes on that always makes me chuckle. So yeah, but then Jesus comes back onto the other side. And then once he's back on this side, chapter 9, verse 2, we get another story from Mark that's told slightly differently. This in the Gospel of Mark, this is the story of the paralytic that is brought to his house, and they tear open the roof, and he drops, they drop it down. It's the same story. Matthew just tweaks the details of it. But again, it's the same beats. There's friends, brings the guy to heal Jesus. He says the exact same thing. Is it easier for the Son of Man to forgive sins or to tell a paralytic to stand up and walk? And so we get that connection between spiritual health and physical health. And Jesus, and basically by Jesus saying, I'll forgive sins, I'll forgive this person's sins, he's basically saying, like, I'll do both. I have power over both of these things. What's interesting is the scribes, right? Oh yeah, there were some scribes, chapter 9, verse 3. Then some scribes. So the scribes actually, their criticism of Jesus is not really a legitimate gripe. Because in the temple system, forgiveness of sins, it would be the priest who is a representative of God who would declare that your sins are forgiven. I mean, God doesn't open up the heavens and say and like speak to each and every one of us that our sins are forgiven. It's a clergy person who is speaking on behalf of God. So this idea that who has power to forgive sins? The priests had power. The temple priests had powers to forgive sins quite a bit, and they would never claim that they were the ones forgiving the sins. It was God doing the forgiving, but they're the ones actually doing the declarating. Jesus tweaks it a little bit. It says, and claims this title of Son of Man. And and sort of elevates himself in a way that's above the priests of the temple or the scribes in this case, to be on more level ground with God, but still the scribes' criticism of Jesus is kind of shallow, kind of lightweight in this case. More you just sort of get the sense that they're irked with him. They're trying to come up with something to kind of, but the crowd's not buying. That's I think the takeaway from this is that the crowd sees Jesus as one of them, one of their champions, someone who's really taking great interest in their plight, which is what you get at the end of the chapter 9. So if you don't mind jumping ahead to verse 35 of chapter 9. And you can see why the crowds are so enamored with him. You can see sort of his popularity, his populism really gets mentioned in chapter 9, verse 36. And when he saw the crowds, he had compassion for them because they were harassed and they were helpless, and they were like sheep without a shepherd. And so his popularity is growing among people because he's taking a great deal of interest in them. And he's showing a great deal of empathy and compassion and care for them, taking time to, it says that, he was curing every disease and every sickness. He was on his way to burnout, to tell you the truth. I mean, which when we get to the story of the Canaanite woman, a little bit later, we might get a little bit of burnout Jesus in that story. But here you can kind of see where his popularity is growing among the people. They're very, very much enamored with him. So I appreciate those you mentioning that, John. Any of the other healing stories that spoke to you, or you had more questions about, or online on the Zoom? Do you have one that you're like, oh, I'd like to dig in just a little bit deeper with that one?
I do.
Yeah. Kristen?
So this is the first time I'm going through the Bible like this.
Yeah.
And so when I got to the centurion in 8, and I was listening to him, what my anticipation of Jesus's reaction, oh my God, you're so arrogant, right? Telling me what to do, and other people listen to you, and now you're going to speak for me. So I wasn't, so I was surprised when the response was like, oh, he has more faith than anyone, or, I've never seen someone of such great faith. And that just didn't, I was curious about that, like how you read it, or a different way to see that is consistent with what's here.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, anyone want to reply to that before I do?
That's a great question. I wondered why he said he has such strong faith.
Yeah, so the way that this has been interpreted most consistently is, here is a man as a centurion. So a centurion so let me give you a little bit of background. So a centurion in the year 30, 31, 32, 33, that time frame that we're in, would have been a person with great power and great influence. This is not a common, we sometimes think of a centurion as a common soldier. A centurion is not a common soldier. Is the centurion a general? No. But is a centurion a major? Maybe a lieutenant colonel, and that sort of
There's some centurions at
the cross.
yes.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. There's centurions at the cross. These are not These are not your rank and file privates. Like these are people with great authority and a lot of power and a lot of responsibility. So the centurion, by saying, I got a lot of people under my control. I've got a lot of authority. when I say jump, people jump. When I say do this, people do it. I could go get a healer anywhere. But I'm coming to you, a non-Roman, someone who is, in terms of the social ladder, is way beneath him. He could go to a Roman doctor and say, come and come and see my daughter, or my servant. This is the servant, I'm sorry. And so I think, Kristen, it's the faith is that the centurion sees something in Jesus that someone of his position as a non-Jew, as a person of great power, often would think of Jesus as someone beneath him. And so so I read that Jesus was amazed by him coming to ask him for help, by the centurion coming to ask Jesus for help, as an act of humility and faith on the centurion's part, because he could go almost anywhere else, but he came to Jesus. Does that make sense?
That makes sense. Can I ask a follow-up?
Of course.
If these other people that he could go to, I think I recall you saying, maybe in a different study, that there's other people around at this time performing miracles. Is that true? Is that accurate? Okay.
For sure.
Yeah, okay. So, which I have a little bit of a separate question about. Okay, so I guess that kind of explains that. He could have gone to anybody. There's other people doing miracles. He comes to him. And
Right.
It wasn't like a challenge or saying, I'm gonna, okay. I get it. Yes, that makes sense. And then the other question about other people doing miracles was, I guess it's interesting to me that it was Jesus who inspired this sort of awe, right, in everybody. And were there any other of these miracle workers having the same kind of following?
They actually making paralyzed people walk and.
Yeah, so there are other, right, so we have our gospel accounts about what Jesus is doing. We have to go to other sources, obviously, outside of the Bible to find what these other people are doing, right? And there are accounts of other miracle healers, other teachers in the Jewish tradition, in some of the other mystery cults of the ancient world, that kind of thing, of people doing miraculous things. And we have to kind of, all we can do is read those and take them on face value or what have you. In the Old Testament, there are Hebrew prophets who are doing miracles, who are healing people and stuff. So there was definitely a tradition in Judaism that a prophet would have healing ability. But we sort of interpret Jesus's healing ministry just slightly differently, because he's doing things for non-Jews, he's doing things for women and men. Like there's just a different feel to his healing ministry than maybe some of the other ones that we have records for.
I guess it makes it more profound, actually, that they were run at the same time. So yeah, thank you. That's super helpful. Thank you.
Well, yeah. So it's those are great questions. Really, really great questions. The other thing I would say is back to the centurion real quick. I think what he's saying by kind of boasting is basically saying, like, I'm in a position where I don't have to ask. I tell people to come heal I tell people to come heal my servant. I don't come ask them. But I'm humbling myself before you because and I'm not telling you to do anything. I'm asking you to help me. And I think that's where Jesus is pretty amazed by that. And I get it, I've done something for some people, like in my own little world, I consider to be people of great renown, and they come to me for a favor or ask me for something, and I'm just like, oh my gosh, like, who am I to help you? Like, this means a lot to me. So I kind of connected with Jesus, going like, oh my gosh, there's this this is a big wig coming. Like, he's not, he doesn't get a lot of big wigs at this point, right? So I get it, I get it. Quick question, or look, quick little, fun, little fun thing. So chapter 8:14 is, we have proof that Peter was married. So, when the disciples, when Peter and Andrew and James and John, leave their business behind and start to follow Jesus, that came at a cost. James and John, left their father's business, and Peter, when he went on the road with Jesus, there is no evidence that his wife came with him. So we get the sense that Peter, at least for a time being, when he was walking with Jesus, and doing that, and we have nothing in the book of Acts that says that Peter's wife went with him to Jerusalem or any of that kind of thing. So, but at this point, we get a sense that Peter's married. I will say 90% of people read chapter 8:14 to 17 as proof of Peter being married. There's 10% of people who take chapter 8:14 to 17 as proof that Jesus was married. Because it's just a bunch of pronouns. So when Jesus entered Peter's house, Jesus, saw is the his Jesus, or is the his Peter, mother-in-law laying in the bed with Peter, and Jesus touched her, the mother-in-law's hand, and the Peter left her.
It says, my version of the name.
Right, so, but it is a pronoun.
Oh, okay.
It is a pronoun. So your translation took the liberty to say, all right, I'm gonna make sure people don't get confused. But in the actual Greek, John, it's just his. Again, 90% of people read this and read it that it's Peter's. But you read enough Dan Brown conspiracy theory, novels like the Da Vinci Code and everything, and this will be scriptural. It is evasive in some ways, but again, most credible folks. But I always like to bring that up. It's always fun. People always ask questions. Was Jesus married? I'm like, I don't know. I wasn't there. But again, it's just another healing. So I just took the liberty to write these out. So let me just list these for you so you can just get a sense, because when you're reading it through the narrative, they can kind of run together. But let me just read these out for you so you can get the diversity of the people who are being healed. So you have a leper, and I want to get back to the leper here in just a second because it's really important. The leper, the centurion's servant, Peter's mother-in-law, 2 non-Jewish men who have demons in non-Jewish territory, a paralyzed Jewish man, the daughter of a synagogue leader, a woman who has is having blood hemorrhage, 2 blind men, and a demonic mute. So you get a real wide variety. Young, like I said, young, old, men, women, Jew, non-Jew. It's a really holistic ministry. But let me go, there's something very unique about the leper. So if you go to chapter 8, verse 1, I want to talk about the leper real quick. So Jesus is, Matthew actually does a great job in terms of like doing a great narrative transition. Recognizing that Jesus was up on the mountain doing the Sermon on the Mount, he actually has Jesus come down the mountain. So that's actually a really nice narrative transition. Kudos on Matthew's part as a writer. But once he gets down you get to kind of the sense that once he comes down the mountain, there is a man who is living with leprosy, who comes before him and kneels before him. So that is an act of worship. So the leper is, by kneeling, he is showing contrition and doing an act of worship of Jesus. He he recognizes, or he gives Jesus the choice to do something or not do something. If you choose, you can heal me. And this is one of my favorite lines in the Bible. I do choose. Like Jesus has a choice. He sees someone in pain and ailing, and who is a societal pariah, without community, who had been passed over and walked by countless times. But Jesus says, I do choose. I see you, and I do choose to help you. It really moves me. But then he does something else. So, and this is equally as profound to me as the healing. You know what I'm about to say?
Touched him.
No, he actually doesn't touch him. Read it. He doesn't actually touch him. Not this leper. He doesn't touch him. But he tells him to go and show himself to the priest. So Jesus heals him, but now Jesus tells him, go show that you are clean to the priest. Therefore, you can go through the purity ritual with the priest, which then reintegrates you back into the community. So not only does Jesus heal him, but he gives him community. And once the leper has community, he can work, he can attend synagogue, like he has agency, he has dignity, he has self affirmation, self-worth. Think about the life of a leper in the first century, Palestine. Your only source of income is the kindness of strangers. You're a beggar. That's your only legitimate source of income. That's a pittance of amount of money. So you're hungry, you're tired, you're dirty, like all the things. And so by being healed and then showing himself to the priest, then he is given economic power, he's given dignity, all these things. And I think that gets lost as how vitally important that is, as much as the healing is important. I mean, he heals his pain. I mean, I can't imagine how the pain of leprosy and everything. So there's all of that as well. But now he has the chance for a sustainable, higher quality of life, which really is life-giving. So Jesus heals his life, but then gives him this life-giving opportunity. I've always found that very inspiring about this story. The one that because Jesus chooses to see him and do something about it, but then goes one step further and says, now go advocate for yourself and do that. Which I really.
What is your verse 3? Mine says Jesus reached out his hand and touched the man.
Oh, I'm sorry, John. I missed that in verse
3.
Thank you. I'm sorry. Yes, you were absolutely right. I'm sorry.
So
He does touch him.
the significance of touching a
Yeah.
leper
Yeah.
has to have some specific
Yes.
meaning, as you said earlier, that he did it in so many different ways. But here, I mean, he didn't touch the leper.
Correct.
He didn't, I mean, he
Yeah.
touching this guy.
Yeah. So that is. Oh, thank you for bringing it up, and thank you for catching that, because for some reason I missed that. I really appreciate that. I was going to bring this up later on, but we can do it. We can do this now at the very beginning by touching the leper. So when Jesus now says, I choose to do this, he puts himself at purity risk. So now Jesus is telling this person, go show yourself to the priest so you can be integrated back into the community. But now he is choosing to make himself ritualistically unclean. And by doing that, he should now not be able to enter the synagogue. He shouldn't be able to do all these things. And technically, he's infecting everyone else that he
Right.
touches with his
Well, he
uncleanness.
did that on purpose versus
Yes,
just saying,
correct.
here you
Yeah,
go.
yeah, he chooses. Which is interesting. I was gonna make that same point with the woman who, was bleeding. By touching her, he becomes ritualistically unclean. And he doesn't go to the priest to get, he doesn't do it. So he puts other people's needs above his own. In that way. Does that make sense? I haven't looked and turned and looked at the screen for a second. So everything's good? Okay. So yeah, so I'm so glad you pointed that out, John. I totally missed that. So yeah, so he chooses to kind of take this on, this ritualistic uncleanliness so that the leper can have a new life, which is, absolutely beautiful. So let's go to, chapter 9, verse 18. Because this is the other very significant healing story, I think, of all of them in there. And that's the healing of both the synagogue leader is not named Jairus in this story, but in the other gospels, this synagogue leader is given a name, and that's Jairus. And so this is often called Jairus's daughter. The story of Jesus calling and healing Jairus's daughter. And then I want to talk about the tax collectors real quick, and we'll end with that after we talk about this one. So Jesus is, again, he's in the midst of a crowd. The synagogue leader comes and asks him to help him. And while he's doing that, a woman who has been hemorrhaging blood for 12 years, it says, right? She touches his garment, and by doing so, again, he would have been made ritualistically unclean. It was against Jewish law to touch a woman who was bleeding. Blood was a big taboo. But he does it. I've always been very impressed by Jesus' response. He's so compassionate and so patient with her. He is very empathetic to her plight. And he doesn't say, listen, I've already said I'm going to go help this person over here. I can't do this right now. Come back later. He takes care of the need in front of him. It's a real model for ministry for us, for sure. But she is also one, due to her ailment, she would have been ostracized. 12 years of hemorrhaging blood would have never given her the chance to become ritualistically clean again and reintegrate into the community. And so for 12 years, to be an outcast for 12 years is a long time. What that does to a person's psyche, to feel that isolated, that alone, it's a really beautiful thing. But then he goes and he heals the daughter. So in both cases, the woman who was bleeding and the synagogue leader's child, he calls them daughter. He personalizes the encounter with them, and in both cases, they're reintegrated into a greater society, a greater community. The daughter is reintegrated into her family. The woman who's been bleeding is reintegrated into her greater family and the greater community. It's just a really beautiful, beautiful account. There's also some really fun details. You get the professional wailers, the flute players, the crowd that's making the commotion. You get a real sense of, what mourning and grieving was like in the first century in Jesus's community, with Jesus's people. So that's really good as well.
I love wailing in the national.
Yeah, the wailing and gnashing is such a great phrase for like just your world is coming apart.
I worked with a guy and people would complain, we would use that. And never-
Yeah, the wailing and gnashing of teeth, that's really good. So last but certainly not least, as we close out tonight, I want to talk about tax collectors. So if you can go to chapter 9, verse 9, the calling of Matthew. So that's a really controversial invitation to extend. So I think we've talked about tax collectors in past Bible studies, but just to refresh us. So tax collectors are public enemy number one when it comes to the Jewish community. So they are Roman collaborators.
They're not too popular today.
Well, no, they aren't. But you like to say, they are not the same thing at all. Your typical IRS agent is not a first century tax collector. They are not pocketing off of your misery for having to pay your taxes. So what a first century tax collector was a Roman collaborator. Rome would set the taxes that needed to be collected. But Rome had no oversight on what was actually being collected by the tax collector. So if the Roman tax was just, let's just keep math simple because I'm horrible at it. If the tax by Romans was 10 cents on the dollar, the tax collector might charge you 20 cents on the dollar and pocket the other 10 cents. And of course, who this hurt the most was the poor, the widows, those who had the least amount of money and could not defend themselves against such things. The synagogue leader could push back on the tax collector. I'm not paying that. The widow, the woman who's bleeding, they are in no position to protect themselves from the corruption of the tax collector. So they were despised. And it's not just the Bible that paints tax collectors in bad light. Read the history of the Jewish people by Josephus. And if there is such a thing as a curse word laced first century account, I mean, it would be Josephus's account of the tax collectors in his history of the Jewish people. He uses all sorts of invectives, and so that you just get a sense of who, as a class of people, who they were, and how they were seen. So, but technically, they were still in the Jewish community. They were still attended synagogue. They still did all the things. So they were, so they were Johnny on the spot around town. So for Jesus to invite Matthew to follow him in the same manner that he invited John and James and Peter and Andrew, this is the fifth disciple, right? I mean, this is Matthew's number 5. We haven't even got to the 12 yet. We're only up to 5 at the moment. And so this is a huge ask and would not have been something that we think John the Baptist would have done, that the Pharisees would have done, who also have disciple groups. And so this is really outside the box and really, again, I think shows Jesus's holistic sense of who's invited to participate in this with him, right? I'm not, well, he even says it, right? I didn't come to call the righteous. I came to minister to the sinner. And he's really kind of putting his money where his mouth is, no pun intended, with the tax collector. So the Pharisees used this, Jesus's willingness to consort with tax collectors and sinners. And a sinner in the first century world would be someone who has broken a commandment and has not done what is needed to do to become ritualistically pure again, right? Or clean, if you will. So we don't know what those quote unquote sinners have done. We just know that they're in that class of people who are sort of in between, clean and unclean. They're unclean and they haven't gotten clean yet, sort of thing. And so by eating with them, Jesus is eating with the enemy in the tax collector, and he is indulging those, in the eyes of the Pharisee, indulging those who aren't keeping the commandments. And for the Pharisee, that was very captivating. Because the Pharisees very much loved God and wanted the kingdom of heaven to come, but their understanding of how you bring about the kingdom of heaven was you keep the commandments and you keep them to the letter and you do not deviate. Whereas Jesus is saying, I got a different way. We're gonna do mercy and grace over this commandment keeping thing that you're doing.
Well, next time I want to talk a little bit about Matthew, getting up and going.
Yeah,
He's
well,
in a
that's
pretty good spot. And, what was his history to precipitate that? I mean.
I appreciate you asking the question now, John, because that would give me time to find. No, there is, it's fiction.
Yeah,
It's fiction, but, I'll have to find it.
okay.
But there's a wonderful monologue of that in a play. Of the
Sure.
character Matthew.
Sure.
It's a playwright, it's fiction, but it really just,
Sure.
it's one of the best things I've ever read. But now that I have 2 weeks to find it. So anyway, thank you, everybody. I really appreciate y'all. I hope you learned something tonight and had a good time. So we'll see you in 2 weeks. God bless.
Thank you.